Good. If you want to study contemporary translation theories, the place to start, I think, must be the concept of equivalence. Basically because it's elementary in most linguistic approaches to translation, and the second reason is that the concept of equivalence is very often misunderstood. People think equivalence means saying exactly the same thing in a translation as you have in the text you're working from. The notion of equivalence involves obviously two sides. We're going to call them here the source text, the ones you're working from, that's in the source language, in the source culture, and the target text, which is your translation. It's in a target language, it's in the target culture. Equivalence says that on some level, something on that side has the same value, equivalence to something on that side. And the trick is knowing what the something is. It's not knowing what equivalence could be in itself, it's locating where it is. Let's take a very simple example. You know in English that Friday the 13th is not a good day. It's bad luck day. Now, if we want to translate the idea of Friday the 13th into Spanish, we could say Friday the 13th. Friday is viernes, 13th is trece. Viernes y trece. However, it doesn't work because in Spanish culture, the bad luck day is the 13th, but it's Tuesday, martes. So you're going to have to translate, or you might want to translate, Friday the 13th as having the same value, bad luck day, as martes y trece, Tuesday the 13th in Spanish. And the idea of equivalence came out in order to handle examples like that. You could aim for equivalence on the level of form, when Friday would be Friday, viernes, or equivalence on the level of function, when Friday the 13th would be Tuesday the 13th in Spanish, martes. And equivalence was basically born to handle that kind of problem. Let's work with an example that's a bit more adventurous but still close to home. TV game shows. Most of you should have had some cultural contact with a game show called The Price is Right in English. But you'll have known it by very different names according to your culture. In French, The Price is Right is translated as le juste prix, the correct price. Although why it shouldn't be le prix juste is news to me. In Spanish, it's el precio justo, the fair price, the correct or fair price. Okay, and they're fair enough as translations, I guess. However, in German, we find der Preis ist heiß. The price is right? No, the price is hot. You say, what? How can you translate right as hot? But if you look at it, it's not a bad translation. First, The Price is Right rhymes. It's catchy. It's a nice title. Der Preis ist heiß has the same rhyme. It's also catchy. Also, if you know the game, where contestants have to guess the price of an object, it's a fundamental activity in consumer capitalism, which obviously occurs in all these cultures. The idea of the price being hot refers to the children's game of getting close to an object. You know, you're cool, you're going away, colder, colder, hot, 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 you're coming close. And so it incorporates a whole new string of metaphors which are quite successful. And we could say that this translation, Der Preis ist heiß, is a very good equivalent translation on the level of rhyme and function, although not on the level of form or the semantics of right and hot. Play around with that. You know, think about the game shows you know. If you know people from other languages and cultures, see if they've got the same show, because these things tend to be sold internationally. What's interesting, of course, is that almost everybody believes that their show is the original. They don't believe that the format has been translated. Ask yourself, for example, that the popular game show at the moment is Who Wants to Be a Millionaire in English. And the millionaire works the same in the United States as in Britain as in Australia, even though the American dollar and the British pound and the Australian dollar have very different values. So in theory, a millionaire cannot be equivalent, technically, in those cultures, but in the parameters of the functions of a TV game show, it works. How is it that it works in Spanish when a euro is something different again? I calculated that this game show was born in Britain. It was developed by Pearson. If it goes to the United States, we would have to say something like, who wants to win $1,867,500 American dollars? Definitely not very catchy. A technically correct translation, but not equivalent in terms of function. I'll move on, I think, to what theorists have said about this problem. You can see now what we're getting at, that it's not a problem of being equivalent, it's a problem of being equivalent to what? And most theories of equivalence developed two kinds of what? Two kinds of things you can be equivalent to. Eugene Nida, who is a reference point for this, said, well, you can have formal equivalence when you follow what's written there. For example, Friday the 13th might become Friday the 13th in Spanish. Or, says Nida, dynamic equivalence, when we translate the functions. In this case, Friday the 13th becomes Tuesday the 13th in Spanish. Eugene Nida was concerned with Bible translation, and still is. Here's famous examples, or notorious examples. For example, the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei, as it appears in the Bible. He says that to translate for people who don't know about lambs, Inuits, Eskimos, whatever, we might say the seal of God, the seal, the other animal that they are familiar with. And this would not be formal equivalence, but it could be dynamic equivalence. Other theorists have done similar things, although not quite as radical in their examples, I guess. The British theorist Peter Newmark talked about semantic translation, which follows the source text quite closely, and communicative translation, which tries to convey a message to the target audience and insist on that. These might be seen as two different kinds of equivalence. The Czech theorist Jiří Levy said something a bit different. He looked at translations and he said, well, they can be of two kinds, really. Some show that they are translations, and others don't. The ones that show that they are translations manifest their relation to the source. So we might say, the day that in English culture is the bad luck day, as a translation for Friday the 13th, which we would put there as well. And we would know that this is a translatory text in some way. Whereas many translations, like the game shows, create the illusion that they are not translations, and they would be anti-illusory translations. They would be illusory translations, whereas the others would be anti-illusory. Those are the two categories developed by Levy. They could be mapped on to two different kinds of equivalence. Gideon Turi says something rather similar. Adequate versus appropriate. Adequate would be adequate to the source text. Appropriate would be appropriate to the target culture.